What's up, all you pyromaniacs out there? I'm Houdini, hanging out with Dawgmatica, and we wanted to give you a little blast of insight here for the fantasy season that's upcoming, specifically talking about fantasy playoffs. We will be getting into some of our NFL draft coverage at a later time, most likely at our podcast, which we'll be recording tomorrow.
Yep.
But this one was really interesting as an idea because there are so many people, as we talk about all the different prep strategies that are involved and what you can do to prepare for being successful and especially to winning a championship and being successful in the fantasy playoffs. So we decided to focus our attention to the fantasy playoffs and just dissecting weeks 14 through 17. But we went a little bit deeper than just dissecting this year's weeks 14 through 17.
As we always do. You know, I mean, the fantasy playoffs are something that not everybody pays attention to, although you probably should. I mean, it's something that may not play the biggest factor in choosing one player over another. There are plenty of other things to look at, but if it comes down to it where you're thinking one guy is exactly the same as the next, or they're really close, sometimes these fantasy playoffs really make a difference.
And based on what we unearthed, and we have some earth-shattering type of revelations for you in this video here. I was amazed, and it's definitely going to affect how I draft now, knowing this. So one of the things that we did, we first of all, we dated ourselves and went back from the stats of 2012 all the way back through the stats of 2006.
Yes.
And the first thing that we wanted to find out...
Well, first of all, the reason why we only went back that far is because then it starts to get a lot more into the running back years. It's just a whole different game now than it used to be. So we just wanted to track back as far as we could go without completely separating.
We wanted there to be relevancy.
Exactly.
So, and as we looked further back, we said, well, these stats don't have any bearing on the game that the NFL is playing right now.
Exactly. So,
interesting, as we go back over those last 7 years, we found that we totaled out all the total points scored in the NFL for every season, and then if you take the cumulative average of those, it was between both teams scoring 43.69 points per contest.
Which is slightly more than, 6 touchdowns a game? You know, I mean, it's maybe 6 touchdowns and a field goal, somewhere in that range, which is plenty of fantasy points to be had.
Correct. So the first thing that we were thinking of is saying, okay, well, we tend to know that at the end of the year is where you have bad weather, where it seems right for a lot of players that are in fantasy playoffs that sometimes they don't score as many points. So we decided to look through those 7 years and just total out the points scored in those 4 weeks.
Yeah.
And the number, remember, 43.69 was the number for the average for everything. The last 4 weeks over the same 7 years, 43.63.
No difference, basically.
No discernible difference.
There's no discernible difference. There's the same amount of points scored in a game in week 15 as there is in week 1, basically. It does not matter.
So then this went into how we were further going into trying to figure this out. So we said, there's no difference there. We got to look a little deeper. So what we noticed is as we were working together when we were compiling the stats, is we were counting off and adding up each individual game total. You have some that spiked up huge in the 80s and the 70s, and then you had not seemingly as many or about the same that are in the 30s and 20s and teens. So we then wanted to look at the average. So we took that per game average of 43, basically 43.5 points per game, and said, well, where's like a real discernible difference of holding someone down? And the conversation, I believe, is when we decided on 30 points. Yeah. And 30 points was 31% lower than the average.
Yeah, because when you're looking at a game that has 30 points scored in it, you're talking 17 to 13. That's not a lot of fantasy points to be had.
And that was the question. It was, how many points are you feeling good about your player getting in a 17 to 13 game? Not
really good. So that's pretty much where we cut the line.
So we drew the line there, and what we found was, first of all, during these 7 years, over these 4 weeks, that's 448 NFL games played.
Yes.
So the number of games where there were less than 30 or less combined points scored between the two teams was 85 times.
85 out of the 448, which comes out to a percentage of, it's 19% of the
Right.
games. So a little bit less than 1 out of every 5 games, you get a real dud.
Right. So then we said, okay, let's take it a step further, and let's look at the games that really destroy your season. So it's if we went for teams that scored a combined total between 21 and 16 points.
Yeah.
And this represents 52% lower than the average. And we found was that there were 16 times of the 85 games that were under, which is 19% of the games under 30, were between 16 and 21 points scored total between the two teams.
Yeah, so I mean, to be honest, it's really not that many that get down to that few of points where your fancy guys are pretty much putting up nothing. But it's still a significant number to be looked at. I mean, 16 games where you're getting nothing. I mean, there's something behind that. We got to go even farther for sure.
So we did. So then we looked at the ones that scored 15 points or less, where we found that happened 9 times.
Yeah.
So out of the games that were under 30, 11% of the time it represents that you're going to get these horse crap games. But the other thing that you have to realize is that combine those two together, it's 25 games.
Yeah.
Out of 448 games.
Yep. Not a lot.
Not a lot.
not a lot, but still, again, it's a significant amount, especially when you're looking at, like, as we were saying, the 30 or less, 85 times. That's a significant amount. And, I mean, it doesn't mean much to just hear the number 85 out of 448. You got to go a little farther and find out who those teams are, why those 85 games happened. So we went a little bit deeper into it.
Well, and that was the thing. So we started saying to ourselves, well, what do we know from all of our time watching football and playing fantasy football is that whenever you get two teams that are in the same division, it usually makes it, just the familiarity between those two teams makes it difficult for there to be big blowout games.
Yep.
And when we looked into the 85 games that were under that magical 30-point mark,
Yep.
we found that 39 of those 85 games, 46% were divisional matchup games.
Yeah, which is obviously huge. I mean, we've all had our suppositions on how much, like we were just saying, how much an interdivision game matters, and it really does. I mean, when you're talking over half of the crap games where you're getting nothing out of fantasy are interdivision games, obviously it's something you need to pay attention to. Now, I mean, that's not the only thing, obviously. It's not just the interdivision.
Right.
Got to go a step farther. What else is there that could affect these games? And, of course, we've all wondered about the cold weather.
Right.
And, obviously, we dug into it. And
So what we did was, okay, so when we were looking at the cold weather teams, the teams that we included in the cold weather that we looked at were Buffalo, Baltimore, Cincinnati, Cleveland, Denver, Green Bay, Kansas City, New England, Chicago, both New York teams, Giants and Jets, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, Seattle, and Washington. Now, when we looked at all of these teams, we were only concerning ourselves with, of the 85 games, how many of them were played in these places. So these teams had to be at home.
Yep.
And we found out that of these teams, 47 of the 85 games,
well over half,
55%.
55% of those 85 crap games happened in a cold weather state, in a cold weather locale. It's obviously going to make a difference when you have that cold weather coming out.
Right.
It slows it slows things down a little bit. You run a lot more. It's not the high flying offense like you've seen all season. Obviously, the wind plays a factor. Whether it's rain in Seattle or it's snow in New England, it makes a difference in throwing the ball, obviously. So there's a lot more running, and obviously the time gets taken off the clock a lot easier. So not as many points are going to be scored usually. It definitely does make a difference, and it's something to watch for because obviously during the fantasy playoffs, that's December. The cold weather is going to make a factor.
Right, and so then what we wanted we wanted to know who were the biggest culprits. So we found out, by just grouping everyone together. But then we decided, okay, we got to go through every team.
Yeah, absolutely.
And figure out, of those 85 games, how many of those games was each team involved in.
Yep.
And this is where this is where like the revelations just started happening for us, and then we could finally discern a pattern of things that were happening, tendencies. You know, we have this belief already. We discovered about the cold weather. We've discovered about the divisional matchups. But who are the guys that are just repeat offenders?
Yeah.
So the biggest repeat offender is the New York Jets.
Yes.
They were 11 times out of so, and you got to think about it. So that's the 7 years. It's the 4 weeks. So 28 games that they played in.
Yep.
11 of those
11
games.
of them. There's under 30 points scored, and you know some of them obviously even 16 to 21, or even under 15 points. You know, under 15 points. It's kind of ridiculous how they're there. I mean, they obviously have been. They haven't been the greatest offensive team as is, so you might suspect something like that. But obviously, being in cold weather, and playing those interdivision games, a tough division, it makes a difference.
So they're number one. The number 2 team, and you had a tie at number 2 between 3 teams that each had 10 times they had the luckiness of being under the 30-point total. That's Kansas City, the Cleveland Browns, and the Buffalo Bills.
Yes.
And then we looked one more further. So the 2 teams that finished with 11% at 9 times was Miami and Pittsburgh. So these teams they're there all the time, and it wasn't like it was grouped in just 2 years. It was spread out.
Oh yeah.
These guys were there at least once or twice every year in those 4 weeks.
And when you look at all these the major culprits of this, the guys that just don't score points towards the end of the year, as we were mentioning, I don't know if you might have been confused by this. That's a percentage of all of the teams. That's not just the cold weather teams, because obviously you heard Miami in there in the last instant. But if you notice, the ones that are the biggest culprits, I think it was, I don't know how many you just mentioned there.
6
teams. 5 of the 6 are cold weather teams, and obviously Miami was the other.
And when you're talking about the percentage there, so these 6 teams equal about 70%.
Yep.
Of the time.
Oh yeah, pretty much, yeah.
They're in it.
Yeah, those are the teams that are going to be in the game one way or another. It doesn't matter who they're playing; they're going to be in the game where there's going to be no points.
So then that brought me to my next revelation. When I'm looking at it, and I'm recognizing we're talking about divisional matchups, and I'm seeing here on the list you have the Jets, you got Buffalo, and you got Miami.
Yep.
That's 3 teams in the AFC East.
Yep.
And New England were 6 times.
Yeah, they actually had 6 games. Surprisingly, for as high-powered offense as they are, even they were in there because hey, it's cold weather and it's a lot of interdivision games with teams that don't score either.
So the AFC East, out of the 85 games that were held under 30 points over the last 7 years, they are responsible for 37 of those games. 44% of the games are because of the AFC East.
Yep, but there's another division that also plays a big factor in it.
Right, when you look on the list here, Cleveland, Pittsburgh, and then you also throw in Cincinnati and Baltimore.
And Baltimore even had, I think, 5 times out of the 85 they were involved in a game.
Combined for them, they're 31 games out of the 85, representing 36%.
So of the full 100%, the AFC East and the AFC North combined to have 80% of that 100%.
68 of the 85.
Unbelievable.
So this is a lesson now. I never expected that this is what I was going to find when we started doing this. So the fact that we're in a situation now where I now know, and this is where, tell the story, D-Rex is not here recording this with us, but he's the prime example of being bit by this math.
Yeah, he's not here to defend himself, but he'd have nothing to defend himself with, and he would fully admit to this happening. Last year's draft, I remember he ended up taking Tom Brady, and he had his choice of a few other guys, but he ended up taking Brady because, as we all know, he loves his Tom Brady. But then I mentioned to him when the draft is over, I'm like, you realize, did you look at his fantasy playoffs? And he's like, no, not really, but I'll worry about it when I get to it. I don't really care about that very much. Sure enough, it turns out he's in the championship in 3 different leagues. He's got Brady going for him. And Brady puts up nothing in that week 16 game, and he loses all 3 championships. Because, I mean, I hate to say it, like we're telling you right now, while we're proving it, it makes a difference what happens in those fantasy playoffs. It makes a difference where those teams are playing. It makes a difference who you're playing. So you really got to look at that sort of stuff, and we're showing it to you right now.
Yeah, and then that brought up another interesting fact. So the first thing that we wanted to do, we had these 6 teams that are the biggest culprits of destroying, blowing up, really just dominating.
Again, just to repeat them, so it's beaten into your head.
The New York Jets, the Buffalo Bills, the Miami Dolphins, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Cleveland Browns, and the Kansas City Chiefs. So we wanted to now look at the upcoming season and look at these 4 weeks of the upcoming season and say, who are these guys playing? And so we start looking through and looking at their home and away schedule, and it's very interesting. We find that I wanted to know, number one, as we were looking at it, how many times do these teams themselves
play each other?
So the Jets twice. The last 2 weeks of the season, they're going at home versus Cleveland and then on the road against Miami.
Yep.
Then you had Miami. Oh, this is just screaming to you. Don't take anybody on Miami that you need to rely on in the fantasy playoffs, because 3 of their last 4 games are divisional games, but they also include 3 of the teams on this list. At Pittsburgh, then they get home for the Patriots, who we said also is done it 6 times.
But it's also interdivision.
Exactly. Yeah. At Buffalo, home for the Jets.
Yes.
Oy.
I mean, as much as you're going to be tempted because of the new look offense and all that sort of stuff, just keep this in the back of your mind. Remember, we said this. Miami's trouble when it comes to the fantasy playoffs.
Pittsburgh's another one. They're doing it twice going up against these guys. They get home for Miami in Week 14. Then they get a divisional game, home for Cincinnati in 15, at Green Bay, and then home for Cleveland in Week 17.
Yeah.
And Cleveland finishes the season with at the Jets and at Pittsburgh being on this list.
Yes.
So Kansas City is the only team that comes out of this scot-free, not playing anybody else on the list. Buffalo has got Week 16 against Miami, so they only hit it once.
Yep.
But then we also looked at, because the divisional matchups proved to be another issue.
Obviously a big issue, yeah.
And tell everybody what we found about Week 17 this year.
Well, we're not sure if you guys knew this, and I tell the truth, I thought I had heard it somewhere, but we decided to make sure. Every single game in Week 17 is an interdivisional game. That means Chicago is playing Green Bay, I believe it is, in Chicago. Everybody's playing somebody in their division. As we were saying, it obviously makes a difference. These guys playing interdivision, everybody's familiar with each other, and they're usually not as high-scoring games. Now, what this is saying, don't have your fantasy championships in Week 17, basically. It really, first of all, people tend to sit people or whatnot.
But here's the best part. I think what the NFL is doing by this is trying to help the team play the leagues that do have a Week 17 championship, because by having the divisional matchups, I think what they're hoping is that they're going to have a lot of divisions still up in the air, teams fighting for seedings and have to do it against a division foe.
Yeah.
Which should make it more interesting. But again, I agree. Don't wait till Week 17. Yeah. It should be over by then.
Yeah, I mean, in any case, Week 14, Week 15, Week 16. Week 14, there's 4 interdivision games. Week 15, there's 5, and in Week 16, there's 6.
Right.
So they keep getting to be more and more as it goes along. Obviously, 6 out of the 16 games in Week 16 will make a difference, but I mean, it's not all 16 games at least.
Right. So now this is where we took it again, one more step deeper. So we already gave you the 6 teams that you want to be aware of. If you have players on these teams for the playoffs, or if you have a team that's a player playing against one of these teams, don't expect a lot of high scoring points, because it's just what the numbers bear out. So the same thing when we looked at the whole fact about the divisional matchups. And then you mentioned Week 14 there's 4, and then 5, and then 6, leading up to everybody being a divisional matchup in the last week.
Yep.
So we then wanted to look at what are those divisional matchups.
Yep.
Because knowing that those games tend to be at a higher percentage, which in the lower, also let you know that you're not going to see too many of those matchups being the spiked average with the 65 total point games, 80 point games that we saw from other matchups.
Yes.
So this is interesting. Half of the league is playing at least 2 divisional games
Yep.
of the last 4.
Of the last 4, at least half of the teams in the entire NFL are going to be playing interdivision games. And obviously, yeah, go for it. Go ahead
So,
and name.
well, here's the other part. 9 teams, 9, are playing 3 of their last 4 games as divisional matchup games.
And it's important to know which ones those are. You got Houston,
Right.
is one of them. Jacksonville is another. New Orleans and Carolina, Seattle, Arizona, San Diego, Miami, and Oakland.
Right.
So be wary about guys on those teams.
Now, here's the one thing. When you look at these teams, Houston, okay, yeah, you got some fantasy producers there. Jacksonville, well, they're not a powerhouse for offense. New Orleans, yes. Carolina, potentially with Cam Newton
Sure.
and what you can do there. Seattle, there's another one that's so right
Hey.
there. Houston, New Orleans, Carolina, Seattle. You know, I don't need to mention San Diego, Arizona, Miami, and Oakland. I think, Miami, they've added all the guys, but I'm telling you, stay away from Miami.
Yeah.
I'm worried, about, this worries me about a Russell Wilson, about a Cam Newton,
Sure.
about a Drew Brees, about an Andre Johnson, about an Arian Foster. As an extra, those tough divisional games.
Yeah, no, obviously.
At the end of the year.
Yeah, but one of the things that we need to point out here, in contrast to what we were saying about all those culprits, the Jets and the Bills and all that, there's also other teams on the opposite side of the spectrum who rarely, if ever, put up 30 points or less in those last, in the last 7 years.
Right. So those would be Arizona.
Arizona doesn't have a single game where they've been a part of a game where it's under 30
Bad
points.
defense.
Yes, bad defense, obviously, that doesn't help.
New Orleans was there only once.
Once. New
They
Orleans
have
was
great
there
offense. Indianapolis
twice.
and San Diego.
Twice. Now, what
This
this
is-
also shows
yeah.
is terrific, because when you look at all those other teams we were talking about, the ones that are big culprits, cold weather teams, outdoors,
Besides Miami, or just bad.
who are just bad, obviously. But these 4 teams that we just mentioned, Arizona, warm, always warm. San Diego, warm, always warm. And of course, New Orleans and Indianapolis,
Right.
indoors.
Well, which Arizona is also retractable roof,
Yeah,
so
of course.
basically indoors as well.
Yeah.
So in San Diego, where it's 85 and sunny every day of the year,
Every.
wonderful to be in San
Yeah.
Diego.
So, I mean, obviously, a big point is proven just by looking at both sides
Yeah.
of the coin on that, obviously. Cold weather plays a big factor, obviously. The interdivision games make a huge difference. Another important thing to point out here is it seems to be the AFC that's a lot of the big culprits.
Well,
as
let's think about it too, because what it really seems to be, it's the AFC East and the AFC North. So it's these teams that are in that northeast area, which
Yeah.
has been getting probably the more volatile weather.
Yep.
When you get snow or you get stuff in Kansas City and in Denver, it usually doesn't come associated with blurry, crazy wind
Winds or
gusts
anything
of
like that,
45 miles an hour, which
Yep.
you get on the East Coast. And the East Coast has just been destroyed by weather as of late.
Oh,
So
for sure.
that's what's interesting, and you don't see it really with the NFC teams there, because there are no NFC teams. The North is the closest you come, with Chicago, which is outside in Green Bay, but you got Detroit's in a dome, Minnesota's in a dome, and then the NFC. You would expect that the NFC East
You would think.
would show up there, but there's only one in that division. There's only one matchup you got to worry about.
Yeah, that's Dallas.
Dallas
Philly.
and Philadelphia.
Yeah, I think it was 6 games they had.
Five games.
Yeah, it was 5 games where they played each other over these last 7 years that were under 30 points, and it's really a rare.
And it was
see.
amazing, because I think it was Philadelphia was in 6 games
In 6
total
games.
that were under 30. 5 of them against Dallas.
Dallas.
Dallas was in 8 games. 5 of them against Philadelphia.
Philadelphia,
So. I didn't look at that to see, where they match up, but I bet you they're playing each other in the last 4 weeks.
It wouldn't shock me
then
either.
beware of Philadelphia-Dallas matchup
Absolutely.
as well.
So basically, we dug pretty deep here for you guys. We got into all the suppositions, all the things that you think might affect what goes on, especially in those later weeks of the year.
Right.
They really do. The cold weather. If you can avoid it at all costs, I'd do so, and especially if it's an interdivision game, you combine them both together somewhere in the AFC, obviously. Those are things that you want to possibly avoid when you're thinking about your draft. You know, it's
Yeah.
not even just, you know, as you're playing those games in particular, when you get to that point in the season, when you're in the fantasy playoffs. And
Well,
whatnot.
and I think we did kind of like what we do with the power rankings.
Mhm.
I think we kind of did that here, showing that these 6 teams, Jets, I'm going to say it again, Jets, Buffalo, Miami, Pittsburgh, Cleveland, Kansas City, these are the dogs.
Yeah.
So if you're relying on players on these teams to be the top player on your team, it's not going to necessarily bode you that well come fantasy playoff time.
Yeah, no, it's not. And we also did a little research into. I mean, I'll just mention it real quickly: 300-yard passers, 100-yard rushers, and 100-yard receivers during those last 4 weeks of the season. It seems the same amount of running backs run for 100-yard games.
The last 3 years was pretty much
the
identical.
last 5 years.
5 years.
5
right.
years. There's
It's
been
either
either
33 or 34.
34, exactly. And obviously the wide receivers has gone up lately because of the, you know, obviously the passing has gone ballistic in the NFL. And I think, and the 300-yard passes have gone up as well with all the passing going on. But in general, yeah, it's...
So your lessons learned today: stay away from the AFC East, stay away from the AFC North, beware of the divisional matchups. Remember those 9 teams: Houston, Jacksonville, New Orleans, Carolina, Seattle, Arizona, San Diego, Miami, and Oakland, who have 3 of their last 4 games against divisional opponents. And with that, that's all the nuggets we got for you on this one. We'll catch you next time.
All
I'm
right.
Houdini.
Dawgmatica here. We'll see.